Happy January, teachers. We are back. I'm hoping everyone had a really restful break and you enjoyed your 2 weeks with your friends and your loved ones and your family. So, one of the things that we've heard from teachers across the district is the challenge of trying to work with students who have such reduced attention spans and trying to navigate what that means in your lesson when kids tune out after 5 or 10 or even 15 minutes at a time. So, as we've been having our conversations with instructional leaders across the district, we've hit upon one strategy in particular that has really yielded a lot of results and a lot of positive change for teachers and for students. And that is the state change. So, we're going to talk to you today about state change and what that means and what it looks like in your classroom. And then you're going to hear from two of our instructional leaders, Emily Eskridge at Stevens High School and Valerie Sines at John Jay. And they're going to talk to you about how they've used state changes in their classroom and what kind of results they've seen from their students. So I think the first question that we ought to talk about is what is a state change? Kelly, when we talk about state changes, what exactly does that mean?
Well, when we talk about state changes, we're really talking about the change in the way the student is processing information. So you really want to think about how you can re-engage a student's brain in the process of learning. Often we want to give students, we feel like there's just so much information. I just have to give them all this information. But there's a point where the brain just kind of stops receiving that information, and if we don't put those breaks in for students, they're going to create them themselves. So there's some brain research that backs this up, that we really need to give information in short spurts and kind of change the way that students are receiving that information. So it's just changing a little tweak of the learning process. It can be big, it can be something small, and that we're going to just share some ideas how that can work.
I really like how you said that if we don't give kids a state change, if we don't give them sort of a mental pause, they're going to give it to themselves. They're going to take that pause anyway. So I can stand in front of the room and lecture to kids for the entire class period, but that doesn't mean that any of it is going to sink in or stick after the first 5 minutes, 10 minutes. If I'm just going to keep going, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're really learning anything.
Well, you hear conventional wisdom that uh, you double the age of a student and that's how long they can pay attention. So,
Mhm.
like 16-year-old can pay attention for 32 minutes.
That's a
How
long time.
Right. However, when you go back and read it, it's stay on task for 32 minutes. So
Okay.
that's not necessarily just sitting and listening. Uh, Sitting and listening is really going to appeal to that auditory learner, which is only like 30% of learners. So we're missing out on a whole lot of students when we want them to just sit and listen to a lecture, and we think they're going to receive and retain that information.
Tony, you've been in a lot of classrooms observing teachers, observing kids. What does this look like in the classroom, that idea of the state change?
Yeah, so that's a really good question, and it's a big question because it looks really different in a lot of classrooms, and there's a lot of strategies that you can use. Kelly said earlier that it could be something big or it could be something small, and I've seen teachers do something a little bit bigger, which might be instead of just having the warm up be a question that they might write in their notebook, they put it on a post-it and get up and put it on one of the corners of the room so that we can kind of see a way to physically pull kids but get some movement. So that's a bigger one. And I've seen a minute or two cell phone break, a brain break after some intense reading or writing, which is another one that's kind of big because it's there's more time involved. But I've also seen it be something smaller like a turn and talk, or something smaller like okay, we're not going to read this anymore. I want you to jot some note downs. It's these purposeful things that are planned, that are getting some sort of movement, some sort of talking with someone close to them, and for the purpose, I think Kelly said it really well, of slowing down and giving kids time to process what they're learning and kind of consume it all, before they move on to processing another complex thing. And as we know, things can get pretty complex in English really quickly. So I think these little breaks are really important. And the other thing we're seeing is that we're needing more of them in the classroom. We used to think of the class being divided up into kind of a warm up and then some direct teach from the teacher. And then students are working independently or in groups and they're closing. So maybe 3 or 4 kind of chunks. And what I've seen in classes where this has been really effective, and these are freshman classes and these are retester classes. These aren't like AP kids necessarily. Is that they're going like 6 to 8 state changes or breaking up the lesson into 6 to 8 pieces rather than 3 to 4. So it's really doubling that down and really chunking how the lesson's being delivered with the state changes in mind.
So we're talking about some kind of structured transition from one part of the lesson to the next. And 6 to 8 sounds like a lot of transitions. How do we help teachers make that manageable? Because I think if I was planning my lesson for my kids, thinking about 6 to 8 structured transitions would be really daunting, really intimidating. So when we think about the strategies, like what kind of pieces can I do, or what can I do to help make that manageable for myself?
I think one of the ways you can think about this so it's not as daunting is think about how you can make the learning as transparent to the students as possible. And what I mean by that is what are those connections you want your kids to make, and make those opportunities to write or to talk or to move. So for instance, after your warm up, your question might be, how does this connect to yesterday's learning? Or what predictions can you make about what we'll be talking about today based on the warm up? And that could give them an opportunity to write or talk, and that is a state change, but you're also giving them time to process. And if you think about all those points in the lesson, what did we learn about this character here? Have some time to talk. Or what strategy did the writer use in this piece? Have time to talk or have time to write. All those times that you hoping your kids are learning and thinking, just make those really explicit and either have them talk or write or move in some way. I think that's a way that you can kind of think about building in those state changes into your lesson in a way that isn't as daunting.
Absolutely. And that is something that we are going to hear from Valerie Signs quite a lot in her conversation. The interview that we did with her was, she said, I used to try to avoid having these moments where the kids will just turn and talk because they're going to go off task. They're going to talk about all kinds of other things. But to Kelly's point, we have to give them that time, because they're going to take that time for themselves no matter what. So if we can help train our kids to turn and talk about the learning, then we're going to be able to catch and release. We're going to be able to do those quick assessments, but also we're going to be able to keep them focused even longer. So those moments when we turn and talk are really valuable. And I think turn and talk is probably the strategy that we're most familiar with. We may not have thought about it as a state change or as a mental break or as some kind of brain break, but that's one of those strategies that we all, I think, are pretty familiar with from our years of doing Fundamental 5. I think every high school campus in Northside is doing Fundamental 5 in some way, shape, or form, but that's one of those that we should be pretty familiar with already.
Right. And on those days, you do need to give students a whole lot of information in the form of a lecture. You can break that up into opportunities for students to turn and talk about what was the important information you just shared with them. You could have them write on a sticky note what they think the important information was, and then share toward the end of class, so that they're doing their thinking on their own and digesting that information. So that's another way to kind of think about it, where you can still give them a whole lot of information.
Because without that state change, without those manageable chunks, that's really not something that kids are gonna retain, right? And I really like your point, Kelly, that if you've been talking for 5 minutes, if you've been talking for 10 minutes, give kids a 1 minute. Kelly, what did you call it? Like a 1 minute think time, or a 1 minute learning time, where they write down the thing that they thought was the most important, where they write down the thing that stuck with them the most, so that again they can process and retain that information that you've been trying to share, right?
Right, because I don't know if I talked about this earlier, but if you're giving too much information all at once, the students are going to have cognitive backlog. And that's kind of like doing too many exercises, you're going to drop something.
Okay, so I know this sounds like just one more thing that we're adding to your plate, teachers. We don't, and we certainly don't want you to feel that way. When we think about a state change, I know one of the questions you may ask yourself or you may be thinking is, why do I need to do this? You know, that so what factor. Okay, so I know what a state change is, but why is this really important in my lesson? And I think the answer goes back to a couple of things that we've learned about trauma-informed instruction.
So when we think about trauma-informed instruction, and we know that everybody over the past now 20, 22 months has been through some sort of trauma, either themselves or secondary trauma, just because of the crazy world we've been living in. We know that structures and routines and more processing time is gonna not trigger a student as much or allow them to be more successful in a class than they would be if you don't give those strategies to a student. So if you think about turn and talk or movement or writing first, those aren't just good practices for chunking, they're good structures for learning. And if the students know that they're coming because you do them every day or because you tell them ahead of time, this is what we're going to be doing, then it won't be something triggering for them. It'll be something that they are aware of and will aid them in their learning. So these things aren't just good for helping kids digest information in this brave new world, but it also is good for the mind because you're letting it know what's coming and they're prepared for it.
One of the other things that we've also heard quite a lot from Emily Eskridge is about how state changes and structure and routines have really helped build her kids' stamina. And this is something that Emily talked about over the years that she's experimented with even before COVID. So as her kids got more familiar with that routine, more familiar with what was going on in their classroom, she found that they were better able to focus longer on, for example, an SSR task or focus longer on a writing task. It was a way to build their stamina. And Emily has been talking as well about adding not just her agenda to the board, which she does every day, obviously for her kids, but also adding some time cues so that the kids know that the warm up is going to take 7 minutes or the SSR always lasts for 10 minutes. And that's going to help our kids know I just have to do this for 5 more minutes, 2 more minutes. I started saying, thanks to Orange Theory Fitness, I've started saying to myself, I can do anything for 30 seconds. I can do anything for 60 seconds. So if your kids know what to expect, I only have to do this for X number of minutes, then they're more willing to try and they're more willing to sustain that over the long term.
Right. And another thing about that chunking is success leads to more success. So if you have students collaborating or you have students completing low risk tasks successfully, then later when you want them to do something more demanding or more difficult, they're going to be more willing to try that. So you'll see success on a bigger scale.
Okay, so for the next segment, what you're going to see is our interview with Emily Eskridge at Stevens and with Valerie Sines at John Jay. And you can see their actual lesson plan and then how they incorporated this idea of state changes into the different parts of their lesson cycle.